Hi everyone, welcome to Off the Podium. I have a guest from Los Angeles today. Dan, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Well, we'll start with the release that'll come out, the album that will come out on June 30th, right?
Yeah.
Tell us about that album.
Well, it's with a band that I started a little while ago called Burning Ghosts, and you could almost think of it as like an intersection of metal and free jazz as socially motivated protest music. And this record that we've got coming out on John Zorn's label, Sadiq, is our second album, and we kind of look at it as like a rallying cry for progressive people who want to see some change in the world.
Yeah. It's great because even without reading it, I went on to read about the album afterwards, or your project in general, after I heard the album, and the first thing that came to mind was rock and metal music. What inspired that? I've heard the different projects that you've done. One of them was a couple of years ago. You came with your quintet to Seattle, and I had a chance to listen to that. But what inspires these different projects? Because they're quite different from each other.
Well, a lot of it has to do with the people who are involved in the bands. I mean, I've always put bands together around certain personnel and consider the way that they play and how to feature those people best in whatever context I can.
Yeah.
With the quintet, we tend to do a bit more like highly composed, structured music, and with Burning Ghosts, it tends to be a little bit more open, a little more improvisational. I don't know if I would say more improvisational, but the charts are a little bit more, a little less rigid, I guess. And Burning Ghosts really came about because I was mixing a duo record with the guitar player Jake Bossler and the drummer Aaron McClendon, something that they had played together. And while I was mixing it, I really wanted to put a band together with those two people. And the drummer Aaron and the bass player Richard Giddens are long time collaborators, and I've played a ton with Richard over the years, and all four of us were all in Cal Arts together back in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
So there's a long history. So I thought, well, how do I want to feature these people together? And I think for our first record particularly, the idea of like almost having kind of ornette line that was sort of like the trumpet and upright bass, and a metal line that was sort of the guitar and drums kind of come together and make this X that provided a different sound than we normally hear with either of those styles. I mean, Jake's guitar playing is really rooted in heavy metal, death metal, grindcore, stuff like that. And then Richard and Aaron are totally like, totally swinging jazz musicians, but also have a really expansive improvisational palette. And then I'm kind of a wild card, I guess, But having that combination of the heavy guitar with the upright bass, I think, is something pretty unique.
Yeah.
So.
Well, you mentioned John Zorn, right? And another person that comes to mind when I think of prolific composers, musicians, or who are also producing a lot of records. John Zorn is one of those people. I've heard a lot of his records, and also Miles Davis that comes to mind because I remember 6 or 7 years ago I decided it'll be my goal to go through all the Miles Davis albums, and I didn't even I didn't even know he has so many. But I got to one of the last
190.
And I didn't even go through them, but I got to one of the last ones. I think it might be the last one, and I realized it was a hip hop album for Miles Davis, and I was just like, what's going on? And when I heard this record, your latest record that's about to come out, I thought about the same idea. That same thought came to my mind because I've always thought of you as a jazz musician, although we'll talk about the classical background as well, but I've always thought of you as a jazz musician. And when I heard this record, it was so metal, so rock in a lot of ways, and it was exciting to see that someone is willing to step out of whatever barriers that we put on music sometimes.
I mean, one thing that I think, is really inspiring to me about Miles that you mentioned, or since you mentioned Miles, is just the way that he always tried to be pushing himself to do new things and to stretch into new territory that he felt was on the front edge of what was happening in contemporary music and in social settings. I mean, we famously coined the term social music for jazz, and I think really, to me, what that means nowadays is that all of us musicians are coming with a huge range of influences. Like, especially now nowadays, we all grew up listening to tons of different kinds of music. I listen to everything from classical music to jazz to rock and hip hop and electronic music and all sorts of variants of those things. And so when we come to creating music, particularly in an improvisational context, but also with composition, for me, it's all about just letting all the stuff that's simmering inside out in whatever way that happens. And that's why I think, for me, it's really nice to have a bunch of different projects with different people who will bring a different set of influences, and then the style ends up being a result of that, so it's nice because, in that way I can sort of be surprised in my own bands by what comes out. But for me also, I've never really approached any kind of music from a stylistically rigid standpoint. To me, it's always been really fluid, and it's always been about saying something that's a unique representation of what you have inside,
Yeah. I was going to ask you about how you put that record together, because there are different ways of putting it together. When I've had friends who played metal music or rock music, and they've said, okay, you know what, the drummer records it, and then we have a guitar or a bass or this and that. We record layers. How did this recent record? How was it recorded?
Well, they're almost entirely live takes.
Wow.
The first record that we did was mostly free improvisation. There were a couple of tunes and a couple of loose structures or conceptual ideas, but it was mostly free improvisation. Actually, when we went into the studio for that was the very first time the band ever played together. We did the first record almost as a way to capture that first outing, and the way that we approached it is we talked about all the various things that we saw going on in society, on the news and politics and all that kind of stuff, and really kind of let that be the backdrop for our improvisation. So whatever we wanted to express was rooted in a sense of social awareness. And when it came time to start doing gigs and start, touring in support of that first record, we wanted some stuff that we could actually reproduce, so, I brought in some tunes. Jake and I actually co-wrote some stuff where Jake's the guitarist, he wrote riffs and I would write melodies and put the form together. And we actually did several great live shows using the tunes that are on the new record to create our tour, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And then I guess it must have been in November or something. The guitarist, Jake, kind of wrote me and said, hey, are we going to record that stuff? And so I figured, yeah, why not? I mean, the band's been playing it live. We've got it all memorized. Let's do it. Mm-hmm. So I reached out to an engineer friend. We booked a day in the studio, and we went in and got the sounds all set up. And we ran through 2 takes of each tune. Maybe there was one that we did 3 takes, but we just ran through the tunes and called it a day.
Mm-hmm.
And then I went home and I listened to the stuff, and I thought, damn, most of the takes, even the alternate takes, are totally slamming. So we put together the track order, and then had a little bit of fun where we overdubbed some parallel guitars and stuff. At a later date, but all of that stuff was on either riffs or chords that he's basically doubling himself, the way that a lot of typical metal stuff is recorded. But yeah, I mean, all of the basic takes are live takes, so we pretty much left it as is.
Yeah. So you said inequality may be racial, economic, social. For people who might say it's just music and it's just notes, what would that change for anyone going through these hardships, especially in today's world, in the U.S. or around the world? What would you say to that?
The fact is, it doesn't change much. I mean, really, what it boils down to is that I think throughout history, artists want to be engaged in a conversation that's happening about what's going on in the world. And so people make art and music and literature and whatever with that inspiration and with that sort of intention.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the best that you can hope for is that you provide an emotional experience that resonates with people and causes them to think more deeply about the world they live in. And then maybe people go from your concert and take some action.
Yeah.
But really, like I said, I mean, I don't think that making this record changes anything about the state of the world, but I think it enters something expressive into the conversation, and it's it's music that isn't happening in a vacuum. There is something behind it.
And what are some inspirations outside of music that have inspired you to take on projects like these?
Well, I guess this is the first band where I've really tried to kind of draw inspiration from what's happening politically or socially currently in the world. One thing I've actually been talking a lot about with some close friends lately is, like if I were to define what goes into my music, like what's a central motivation, it's kind of hard to put into words, but I think for me it's a balance between a real interest in mysticism and mythology and magic and stuff like that, and a really tactile, earthbound human experience. So be that love or hardship or politics, sort of balancing that picture so that there's inspiration and acknowledgement of both the real world experience and the sort of magical experience of being alive.
Yeah. And you said balance about that aspect, but you've also been able to balance and play a lot of classical music. And when you again in today's world, when you think of musicians, you say jazz musician, a classical musician, and it never kind of maybe it does more now, but it's not the connection is not as much as I would like to see. And you've been able to do that. How have you been able to do that? And what would you recommend to people to do more of so we could really bond better in those two fields that are sometimes far away from each other?
I don't think there's necessarily a magic formula for it. For me personally, my background all the way through college was basically in classical music, although I had grown up around a lot of avant-garde music through my dad was an avant-garde composer, and my mom, who was involved as a performance artist in a number of different kinds of settings, but most notably with the avant-garde opera composer Robert Ashley, and so I was lucky to be exposed to a lot of really unconventional stuff at a really early age. And I was crazy fortunate that I had wonderful teachers growing up who were very open-minded, including the great Wadada Leo Smith, who was my very first trumpet teacher when I was like 10 or 11 years old. And And so I was exposed to a lot of stuff early on. So even though my interest was mostly in classical music, a lot of this stuff was percolating. Yeah. And by the time I was towards the end of my college career, I just was curious about other things, you know, and I wanted to spend time exploring other avenues of music. So I got really interested in grad school in creative improvisation and contemporary improvised music, not necessarily jazz, but improvised music. Yeah. And also at the same time started playing in a band that did a ton of Balkan music mixed with rock and roll. Yeah. So there was a lot of soloing in odd time meters and interesting modes, and that it was sort of, that was an impetus for me to kind of get some, you know, solo improvisational chops together. And it just kind of grew naturally from that. So through all the various avenues of both creative and modern improvised music and sort of this rock, metal, fusion world kind of angle, somehow it all ended up getting me involved in a community of people who were really active in the jazz scene. Yeah. And, you know, just by being around these people and playing with these people and having a desire to be part of that community, I kind of acquired some more jazz language. But I still wouldn't necessarily call myself like a jazz musician, just because I don't really have any background in traditional jazz language. Yeah. And as much as I admire it and as much as I you know, love to hear people doing it, it's not something that I really have a drive to do myself. You know, I, of course, am trying to learn whatever I can about improvisational language and the roots of that, but I'm not trying to go out and, you know, play Cherokee faster than whoever, you know, or anything like that. I'm mostly interested in just playing original music of mine or of people that I know, composers that I know, and enjoy working with. Yeah. And then I've been really lucky that my classical training has basically paid the bills this whole time. You know, so I'm able to work in classical settings and film soundtracks and orchestra settings, sub with, you know, LA Phil or whatever orchestra when they need an extra trumpet or something. Yeah. And then, just in the freelance scene in Los Angeles, I would say 98% of my income probably comes from playing essentially classical or commercial music. Wow. And then it allows me the freedom to kind of spend all my creative time dealing with music that probably isn't going to pay the bills. You know, that's purely there for the sake of creative experimentation. And I think some of it, you know, totally has legs and could go a lot of different places, but I'm not dependent on it to pay the rent. You know, so I feel really lucky that way, and very free with my own creative pursuits. Yeah. So the you know, sort of double-edged sword of that is that, you know, a lot of my practice time is split between, you know, really maintaining and developing, you know, better and better classical chops, and at the same time trying to spend time really exploring the improvisational language. But I think I found a good balance that works for me, and, you know, I feel fairly comfortable showing up in most situations and, you know, turning in my best work. Yeah. You know, so.
Again, with this album, something that some might consider a little bit of a classical kind of an approach are 4 tracks that are a suite. You called it a suite, right? Uh-huh. So tell me about that and why are they connected? I mean, after listening to it, I maybe could put some things together of the connections between them. Tell me about that.
So one thing that I've always really loved and tried to do with my own creative music is bring a sense of the narrative into the music. So even if the tracks are separate, a lot of times, you know, especially when thinking about the way albums are constructed or the way sets are constructed in a live setting, I really try to make the whole set or the whole album or, you know, a through experience for the listener, you know. And I think a lot of that for me is rooted in just my deep love of symphonic music, you know. particularly romantic through contemporary era music and opera and stuff like that. I love the long narrative. I love movies. I love I love to see the way that television is developing through Netflix and these amazing shows that have like beautiful narratives, or like something like Breaking Bad that hold your attention for multiple seasons and give you this long arc. So I like the long arc in my experience as a listener or viewer, and I like trying to approach my own music from that standpoint. So the suites often provide the opportunity to both have separate tracks on an album, but in a live setting, perform them as one continuous thing, and maybe you connect them through improvisation. But the idea is that, like, it's, especially with instrumental music, like, you can give the audience something to think about, and then they can really let their mind wander. Yeah. So like, in this particular context, I might say, I don't want to be too specific with this, but this music is motivated by a desire to see change in our social interaction with each other. And then we go in and we play like a 45-minute exposition on that might go through multiple compositions, but is all coming from that angle. And people can just sit there and experience their own thoughts about it and really have kind of a long time to ruminate, and we can provide a lot of different peaks and valleys in the emotional experience, and have a lot of push and pull with the audience. And I guess maybe it's coming from a little bit more of like a sort of art music standpoint than, say, like a lot of rock records might, where it's a bunch of like hard-hitting tunes. But I like that. It's just something I've always enjoyed. And then another part of that is I used to play a lot with Vinny Golia in his sextet, and that's something he always does. He has all these different compositions, and we'll learn them all, and we have them in the book, and then basically we play continuous sets, and he'll just call tunes, and we improvise from one to the next and get into it, and then improvise out of that into the next one. And you never know what's coming next, so you have to be really on your toes. But they create these really beautiful symphonic kind of scale performances where maybe like you play continuously for an hour plus, and it allows both the player and the listener, I think, to have like a really almost meditative experience with it.
You talked about improvisation, but I want to hear more about this because I really hope that classical musicians, people who are trained and have that background, have more experiences. So one of my youth orchestras, we organized for the first time, we organized a festival, and instead of inviting a classical musician, I invited a violinist who has more of a pop background. He's played with a lot of pop and rock artists, Andrew Jocelyn, and he lives here in Seattle. So I invited him, and then I put the kids on the spot and I asked them to improv as the rest of the orchestra was doing a few chords. And surprisingly, they did so well. I was completely impressed. I was not expecting them to even have any ideas to improv, but they did. Yeah. I've tried similar things with college orchestras, and it hasn't gone so well. So,
well, I think, with regards to improvisation, I think it's something that everybody is able to do. Like, if you've ever read Effortless Mastery by Kenny Werner, he talks about that. Like, if you can speak, you can improvise. I mean, it's a matter of like putting language together in a real time context. And I think in a lot of ways, the less concerned the improviser is with sounding good, the easier it is for them to just kind of speak extemporaneously through their instrument. And that's why I think it's interesting, like the high school kids probably did better than the college kids, because the high school kids are just having fun with it, and the college kids like want to sound good, and in a way it's a little bit paralyzing. But as far as like classical musicians improvising, I think it, in a way, it's a sort of it's easy to forget that people like Mozart and Beethoven were fabulous improvisers.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like Mozart improvised all his piano cadenzas, and often riffed along with the orchestra as he was playing his piano concertos.
Yeah.
And I think it was something that was basically expected of classical musicians long ago.
Yeah.
And then somewhere along the way, it became more about reproducing than playing extemporaneously. Yeah. And I think that the more classical musicians can engage with improvisation, the deeper their replication of compositions becomes.
Yeah.
Because, we all know, well, I don't know if we all know, but a lot of great classical musicians consider that their goal with performance is to make it sound improvised at the same time as being, a pristine representation of what's on the page. Yeah. But if they've internalized the music to the point where it can come out in a way that sounds spontaneous, then it really is a magical experience to hear that. And I think it's hard to replicate that if you have no experience with truly spontaneous playing. Yeah. So I think, improvising is absolutely benefit to anybody that wants to try it, no matter what kind of style you're playing. And I think that the realm of improvisation, more and more, I think it's becoming accepted and even encouraged in non-jazz fields. And I think that's wonderful, and I'd love to see more of that.
So you think we get to a point where we have a trumpet soloist during the cadenza improv?
It's already happening, I think, in certain settings. I mean, a lot of the settings where that happens now, I think there's a nod to jazz. Since Louis Armstrong, trumpet is kind of seen in that way, but I think that there are improvisers like Peter Evans on trumpet who are taking it to a whole other place, where he can play the pants off jazz, but a lot of his improvisations are more in line with avant-garde contemporary classical type things, or even just kind of like complexist music almost, and so, seeing people like that blazing a trail for new kinds of improvisation in different contexts, I think is spectacular. And I think what I was just talking with James Newton, the incredible flutist and composer, who wrote a solo trumpet piece that I just recorded, which didn't have any improvisation in it, but a lot of the language that he's drawing from is going everywhere from Hans Werner Henze to Freddie Hubbard. And so, and he was talking maybe about, expanding that in the future and maybe having an ensemble accompaniment. And in which case, I wouldn't be surprised if there was improvisation involved, and I think that would be fantastic.
You're fairly young and you have many more years to come of great music making, but some of your colleagues maybe who are experimenting and are prolific in their different styles like you are, what are some names, even if you don't know them, but you've seen their name or their work? Who does the kind of work that you do, as far as just the variety of the different styles that you do?
Well, the guy I just mentioned, Peter Evans, is really like, somebody that everybody should be familiar with, just for the sheer, he's an awe-inspiring player. And God, that's hard to kind of put my finger on. I associate most with people in my scene here in Los Angeles, and there are lots of people who are doing things all over the map. Derek Spiva Jr. is a really amazing composer that I think people should be aware of, who's bringing in influences from all over the stylistic and geographical map into chamber orchestra writing. And then guys like John Armstrong, was a tenor saxophonist and composer, is kind of doing not necessarily similar stylistically, but a similar thing, drawing from all sorts of different influences. But the names are everywhere. People like Tyshawn Sori or Vijay Iyer or Steve Lehman or John Zorn or Dave Douglas, or I don't know. I mean, it's hard to kind of rattle off names, but I think anytime you find a scene that's interesting, there's going to be a lot of tangents from that give you a lot of insight into how those people are inspiring each other and working with each other. The record label that I run, Orenda Records, has a really amazing array of artists who maybe each artist may not be as sort of disparate in their approach, but the catalog as a whole gives a snapshot of a scene that I think is highly disparate and influencing each other all the time. And I think the artists on there like Gavin Templeton or Andrew Conrad or Trevor Andrews or Kathleen Pineda or Tina Raymond or Daniel Corral, Evil Genius, Fell Runner, Dave Tranquina, this band called Snow Nerds. I mean, the list goes on and on. Vicky Ray and Scott Ray, Randy Gloss. There's all sorts of interesting music happening that might not seem like it would go together, but all these people are having a profound impact on each other's work.
Yeah. You know, it's always interesting to get some good stories from musicians because there's always something happening behind the scenes or on stage. Are there any stories that come to mind where something really weird has happened and you had to not improvise on your instrument but improvise with the situation? Anything that comes to mind?
Let's see. Gosh, that's hard on the spot.
I remember one time I didn't bring my concert shoes, and we were splitting a concert with a conductor, and he's about 6'3", and I'm only like 5'6", and I wore his shoes instead of these weird white sneakers I had on. So I brought everything except the shoes. So it was that one always comes to mind for me. But how about some great venues that you've played and you always love going back to?
Well, one of the spots that I've got to give it up for is the Blue Whale here in Los Angeles. It's a jazz club, but they are really creative with their programming, and they've brought in amazing people from all over the world, and they've created a home for us to really try a lot of the wild experimental stuff that we do. Love playing there. Love playing with my group at the Monterey Jazz Festival or Jazz Festival Saalfeld in Austria, or Angel City Jazz Festival here in LA. Yeah. In Seattle, got to give it up for the Royal Room and for Cafe Racer. The Racer sessions they do there are awesome. And going back to the Stone this summer in New York, which is just a legendary spot for new music. Yeah. And I don't know. I mean, I love just kind of playing music almost anywhere for people who are interested to hear it. I mean, it could be a dive bar, or it could be a Walt Disney Concert Hall, or, but it's if people are engaged with what's going on, it's exciting to be there sharing something with them.
And one thing I love asking musicians is their hobbies or their outside activities out of music, because you have 100 different things going on. Mm-hmm. What do you do outside of these musical projects? Do you have time?
I'm actually kind of working on trying to find some other things that I like to do, because I think for a number of years I got so kind of heavily involved that I wasn't really doing a lot else. But like I said, I really love movies and cinema, and I like going to see movies almost as just a hobby. Mm-hmm. But let's see, what else do I do? I mean, I like cooking, although I'm not very good at it. I'm kind of trying to get better. My wife and I just kind of started working on a garden at our place, so I'm kind of starting to get into that. And we have a couple cats. I love playing with the cats. But I'm a little bit of a workaholic when it comes to music. So I spend a lot of time doing that.
I could tell with your website and so many things going on. I can't even imagine. Well, tell me about the tour. You planned a tour for this upcoming release, right? There's a tour?
Yeah, it's a brief one, just because of people's summer schedules, but we're going to be doing some more, hopefully in the fall. Mm-hmm. But this summer we're going to start here in LA and then hit up New York and play at the Stone and a place in Brooklyn called Alphaville with some great bands out there. Crux Crux Disinhibitor, which is kind of an electronic thing, and then Twin Whales, which is sort of almost like a Mars Volta kind of rock vibe, and then Grid, which is a heavy kind of noise band. And then we're going to San Francisco and playing at the Hemlock Tavern with some thrashers up there. This guitarist Josh Pollack has put together a bill. And then heading out to Reno to play with a sort of grindcore band called Cranial Galactic Orchestra. And then going to Reno and playing Richard, our bassist's hometown, at a museum called Arte Americas, and playing with a sort of meta jazz project called Jules Winfield, and a vintage Black Sabbath type metal band called Beastmaker. So it'll be a fun week of kind of wild shows, and we'll be kind of thrashing our way up there.
Well, Dan, let me know if you have anything else that you want to share with us. Otherwise, I think I like what we talked about. Yeah, man. I mean, check out the record, Burning Ghosts Reclamation. You can find it at my website, danielrosenboom.com. Yeah. Check out Orenda Records. There's a ton of great music by a really wide range of artists there. www.orendarecords.com. And that's it, man. Thank you so much for having me. No, it was great. I think I told you're only the second person that I've actually met in person. So cool. It's great. Well, if you're up here in Seattle for a tour, it'll be great if you want to do this in person. We could talk about whatever's happened or more stuff. We're hoping for maybe October, November, somewhere in there to get up there. So okay, perfect. Fingers crossed. All right, Dan. Thanks so much for joining me. It was great. All right. Thank you, Tigran. Take care.